fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCO 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. Mr. Dave Martino is back.
I am back.
And so, did you enjoy your karate this last weekend?
Oh, the weekend before last week. Yeah, it's all a blur. I did.
Yeah, and you became the champion of North America.
Yes. Yeah. We'll call it that. It was just a seminar.
champion eater.
That goes without saying.
Especially at the buffet.
Exactly. And they're open again.
Yeah. I bet you're thrilled.
I am.
Well, anyway, hopefully this week is not as crazy as last week. Okay? Let's just keep it civil. Okay? No more getting out of hand.
Yep.
No more police being called.
No.
No more of that stuff. Okay?
No more streaking.
Yeah, no.
Nope.
Well, now, speaking of streaking, we have our first guest this week is a fantasy author. So that's why, the streaking, not that he streaks. It's just that you streaking would be a fantasy.
Yes.
Maybe an evil fantasy.
Nightmare.
So, a nightmare. And he's got another, he's a best-selling fantasy author here. So this is the real deal here. And so he's got a new book out, Malevolent 7, and it's Mr. Sebastien de Castell. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here and hear all about your fantasy of Dave streaking.
Well, that's why it's an evil fantasy. It's not a good fantasy.
All the best fantasies are evil, aren't they?
I don't know. Are they? Is that what makes a fantasy click in the world? Is that what people like? Is the evil in the fantasy?
I think. Well, it's funny because Malevolent 7 is very much a fantasy novel about 7 anti-heroes who have done some terrible things in their past and are mostly convinced that they're largely irredeemable. So I think we do like to explore kind of the range of human behavior, and fantasy is a good place to do that because it doesn't always sort of trigger the same experience, the sort of literal experiences that people have had, right? It's there's a difference between somebody, a story where a character, runs into somebody with a horse, versus, a modern book where somebody, gets drunk and crashes a car into somebody else's car, because we have such a visceral connection to the things that happen, in our world. So yeah, I think fantasy does, give an opportunity for us to explore darkness in a way that is safe, both from, sort of directly, adversely affecting us, but also can kind of get past the filter of our sort of, what we would call meta-narrative notions of like, no, you can never allow a character who did X, Y, or Z to be redeemed. Which if that were the case, Malevolent 7 would be an impossible book to write because it has a bunch of characters who are who think that they can't be redeemed, but we sort of get a chance to see what happens when they try.
So is this part of the passive-aggressive behavior? Like we want the evil in the book, but we don't want them to win, right? We want them to lose still.
I think it can be. In the case of Malevolent 7, I mean, it's really a book about 7 war mages or mercenary mages who are called wonderists in this book, and they basically sell their spells to the highest bidder. And unfortunately, the highest bidder is usually kind of a jerk. And they, these are people who don't think of themselves as having any sort of redeemable qualities. They just view the world as one kind of war after another, and they're just, there to survive as best they can. But unfortunately for them, they end up taking a job that turns out to be part of a conspiracy that could enslave all of humanity, and all of a sudden these characters who are determined not to be heroes discover, as I think we all do sometimes, that even the worst of us have to sometimes step up and be just a little bit heroic. So I think that's a pretty integral part for us, just as human beings, to periodically explore, is the notion that we like to divide everyone up into good people and bad people. But when we do that, we sort of deny ourselves, like as a collective humanity, we deny ourselves a lot of people we might actually need. You know, sometimes you need the firefighter to come to your house, even though they believe things that you absolutely despise, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, how do you keep your anti-heroes likable to the reader? Did you find that a difficult balance?
I didn't with this book, partly because I never really set out to sort of write a character as, okay, they are going to be this, or I'm going to have the audience judge them this way. The only way you can write a villain is, and I'm sure we've all seen this before, you have to write them as if they're the hero of their own story. And it's just that we don't happen to understand at first why they're doing what they're doing. So I always sort of try to write characters from the standpoint of, let's just keep exploring what's inside them. And the more that you do that, even with a villainous character, the more inevitably that we'll start to empathize with him. We might still go, well, that was a terrible decision to make after losing your father in a combine accident. But we sort of go, but I understand that feeling. And one of the reasons I think there was a real pushback in the early 2000s against the sort of classic heroic fantasy, and I'm a big fan of heroic fantasy, but there was a sort of a pushback of it, was because when you have these characters whose every impulse is intrinsically noble, what is there for us as the average, schlubs that we are to relate to and go, okay, but my problem isn't that there's an evil wizard, but it's okay because I'm so brave that I'll just run into it. My problem is that I tend to, lie and hide and cower as much as possible. And I want to know how I get out of that. And that's what I think characters with more gray to them give us, right? They give us a sense of whether they are worse than ourselves or slightly better than ourselves. They give us a chance to say, maybe I could try that approach, or I'm going to, I see what's happening to that character and they're doing exactly what I would do in that situation. Maybe I should try something new.
Well, how do you create your characters? How do you come up with these evil characters?
Well, I almost always work the same way, which is, fantasy is kind of an interesting field because a lot of people imagine that the way that you create a fantasy novel is first you create a world with all of its strange geography and its magic systems and its cultures and its history, and you just sort of write these encyclopedias, atlases, and history tomes. And then you set a story inside of it. And I never work that way. I start with a main character. I start with something that is interesting to me about them. And in a metaphorical sense, I start them in a dark cave, and I give them a flashlight. And the only things I write about or even imagine is whatever's going to be in the beam of that flashlight. So in this case, I started with a character named Cade Ombra, who is himself a wondrous. So he's a mercenary mage. He's in the middle of a job that is, fairly awful. Both sides are kind of awful, but he's actually working for what he thinks of as the worst side. And he's just struggling through this process to try and hang on to whatever little bits of his soul are still left, to pull back from the worst excesses of what's going on. But he knows that that's not a workable way, to be sort of a viable human being. And so what then happens is I then functionally create every other character, every other setting, every other, shirt sleeve to be something that creates conflict and challenge for that character. So his best friend, for example, his only friend really, who we meet, with Cade on page 1, is what's called a tempestoral mage. So a mage who draws their power from this realm that basically is all destructive energies, lightning, thunder, fire, and who absolutely does not give a crap, or seemingly doesn't give a crap about any of these sort of petty moral concerns. And so he can be, this character Corrigan can be bombastic and battle hardened and just, having the best time while blowing up castle walls. And Kate is stuck in this position of going, crap, this is like my only friend. And he's just as awful as everybody else. What does that mean? What am I going to do next? And so all the way along, every character we meet of the Malevolent Seven, who are, 7 of the most messed up, broken mages I think ever put to page. Each one of them challenges them in a different way. So I build out from that. I always start from the character who is at the center of the story. And that's the way that you will always get, for me as a writer, that's how you'll always get an interesting cast, a cast of very diverse personalities. It's also the way that your villains, can gain texture through every, encounter. So for example, in Traitor's Blade, which was my first, swashbuckling fantasy novel, the first book in the Greatcoats Quartet, we encounter this Duke Gillard, who is everything Falkio, the main character of the Greatcoats, despises, right? He seems like he's everything he hates. But in book 2, hating someone, having somebody be everything that you think is wrong with the world is a very comfortable place to be, isn't it? And so so in that book, all of a sudden he starts to see another side of Gillard because he encounters Gillard's, young son, who happens to be a huge admirer of Falkio. And so, every step of the way, as long as you're constantly building characters that challenge your main character, you're going to get that sense of depth. I don't know how well that answered your question, but it was very long, so that's good.
Yeah. Well, and so when you've got this world building as well as your character building, have you ever been to a point where you were, let's say, halfway through and got stuck and didn't know where to go?
Halfway through, stuck and not knowing where to go is my default position as a writer. That is my natural state. You know how people have like resting scowl face or something like that. I have resting writer's block. It's my default position as a writer. It is not, fortunately, a bad place to be when you get stuck. Let's take an example. You've sort of built out some kind of a very formal sort of magic system. Malevolent 7. Malevolent 7 is partly a book where I decided I was just going to go crazy and write whatever the hell I wanted, and I didn't care what anybody was going to think because I'd just come off finishing a 6-book young adult fantasy series called Spellslinger, which I adore, and I loved writing those books. But there's all these things you can't do because it's young adult, mostly involving swearing. So the Malevolent 7 has, more swear words per page, I think, than almost any novel, put to print. But I also wanted to go, you know what? I'm not going to explain how different magic systems work, although I ended up doing that anyway. But there are 12 different magic systems in this book. And you'll often reach a point where you've done all these things that felt really fun and exciting at the time. And then you go, oh crap, now I'm stuck. There's this thing that can't possibly work given this, or that you just don't know what to do next. And when that happens, that's actually when you're forced to come up with something really clever, right? Because it's not, because if it looks to you like, okay, well, given everything we know about how magic works, there's no way this is going to work. And you know that if you just go, oh, haha, the rules are different than we thought, that's going to flop with readers. But you and the reader are in the exact same position at that moment of going, how the heck is this going to work? And so then, you have to really challenge your creativity and your ingenuity. But when you find the solution to that, boy, does it ever feel great, right? Like, because then you as the writer are going, oh my God, yeah, that works. Like that makes it all make sense. And then it suddenly feels like it was planned all the way along. And the reader, when the reader's reading, they're like, wow, this is so great. Like I didn't see it coming, but then, yeah, this was the only way it could work. So that's usually what happens.
Well, do you build your own magical systems, or do you draw from historical sources to create them?
I almost always build my own magical systems because, although I'm, without doubt, you can go through any modern fantasy and go and look at any magic system, go, oh, I can see parallels with this other literary source or this historical source. I mostly try to derive magic systems from things that either for me make sense, or that have kind of a tactile connection to the world. Like I've never created spoon magic, but I'm very likely to at some point, because I think it's very easy for a reader to imagine what it's like to hold a spoon in your hand. And we've all, a lot of us, I think, have seen those old weird spoon collectible collections somebody's grandparents had, where the bottom end of the spoon has some emblem on it or things. And so I look for ways of making magic as tactile as possible. In the case of Malevolent 7, I sort of followed on a principle that I've always thought is one of the only ways that magic can possibly ever make sense, which is the notion that our universe has physical laws. One of the things that, physicists have been speculating for a long time is that other universes, if we live in a sort of a multiverse, will not just have different physical space and different history and things like that. They will likely have different actual physical laws. And so my notion with the Malevolent 7 is that fundamentally what magic is when someone momentarily breaches the veil between the mortal realm and one of these other universes where the laws of physics work differently, and those laws momentarily leak through. Because we don't really know what would happen if you did breach the veil between, a world where, thunder came after lightning and one where thunder came before lightning. We don't know kind of which rules would necessarily dominate. And so magic, a spell, is basically when you breach the plane. And so each of these, every wondrist in the book, is attuned to a particular realm. And so, one of the realms, I mentioned the tempestoral realm, but there's also the infernal realm, which happens to be occupied by beings who can sort of farm out spells, if you will. There's another realm that's the totemic realm, where biological organisms like animals exist as conceptual forms. And so a totemicist, a wondrist who draws spells from there, can actually derive the attributes of a certain type of animal. So we have a swashbuckling, heroic, handsome mage called Arideus in this book, who happens to be a rat mage, and will pontificate all day long on how rats are the noblest creatures of the universe. But fundamentally, what's happening is, regardless of what type of magic, it's basically just a breach between the mortal realm and that realm, or the two universes. And so that those other laws of physics momentarily break through. And that as a kind of as a fundamental sort of underpinning of a magic system, can forgive a whole lot of sins, which is, I think, why I picked it.
Are you ever surprised sometimes by what the readers will pick out in a book? Like when you're telling a story like this one, you kind of have all the things that happen in the world and the magic and all this stuff going on. But sometimes do readers bring out something or notice something that you didn't in yourself, even though you wrote it?
Inevitably. And there's two kinds of contexts where that happens. I always think of what I think of as sort of true reading, and true reading is where you are just reading the book, and you are basically creating the story, right? Because the book itself is just black marks on pages, or on an e-reader, and 99.99% of all things that are happening are not being written about or described. When they, if you're in a James Patterson novel and it says, and they walked into the courtroom, they'll almost never describe the courtroom. You're building the courtroom in your head. And so when people do that, they're all basically going to read a different version of the novel, because they're going to create a different story in their head. And that story is the intersection between the sort of the written text and their own experience. And so, I'll often I remember one time I wrote this book called Saint's Blood, which was the third Greatcoats novel a few years ago. And it had this kind of underpinning about how the gods, basically there's a line in the book that says the first prayer came before the first god. And so it basically says, like, in this world, gods are a manifestation of faith. Right? And so, in a sense, we get the gods we deserve, which is sometimes, not a good thing. And I remember talking to my editor, the inimitable Joe Fletcher, who's just a legend in the field, and saying, are Christians going to be troubled by this? Some of them, and because it's got because also there's this attempt to murder off all the gods and create one, monotheistic God. And she said, well, I'm a Christian and I don't mind. So, and I thought, okay, well, that's not so bad. But then I remember later I got a letter from a fan. I get a fair amount of mail from readers, and this guy was so funny. He said, and I love this book and I love your writing because I see that you are a Christian man like me, and you see how we must avoid the false gods and find the true God. And what he read in my novel, written by a guy who's, basically an atheist, what he read was a kind of allegory for, a sort of, I don't know, Revelations kind of story. And I think that's terrific, right? Because, you want your books to be things that help people kind of come alive in their own imaginations, right? I don't need them. I'm not trying to produce, 100,000 clones of Sebastien de Castell. And as my wife can attest, that would be the worst of all possible outcomes. I'm trying to write things so that people can have the same experience I have when I read a book that I love, which is all of a sudden the world just seems vastly bigger and vastly more interesting than it did before.
Yeah, but also it creates a lot of imagination in people, right? Because he's taking it a different way, and he's also saw you in a different light than what you really are, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think, but, and what he's also hopefully seeing is underneath all of the labels we put on things, whether it's about religion or politics or something else, is a sense of, hey, I feel like there's a connection between me and this other person. And the fact that we might believe very radically different things in no way diminishes that. I mean, I would argue that that's the challenge of our century, right? Is to see each other and go, yeah, almost everything you believe bothers me. And the extension of everything you believe put into practice is even worse. And yet somehow there are things about you that are in me and me and you. And so, we're going to have to kind of get to know each other and figure this out. And so, that's what you're always aiming for. I've always maintained that the job of a novel isn't to convert people to your way of thinking. I mean, I have a very particular way of thinking. I believe in idealism. I believe in friendship as a fundamentally redemptive force. I have a lot of things I believe in. But when somebody writes, one of the questions you get a lot as a novelist is, what do you do when you get like a really bad 1-star review or something? And I would say, when somebody writes, a 6-page scathing 1-star review about how you're the worst author who ever lived and your book is a crime against humanity, when you don't like a book, I'm pretty sure we don't finish it, we put it down. And if we finish it and we hated it, we just put it away and we never think about it again. When someone goes to that trouble and sits for 3 nights writing the most scathing review they can, what it means is they've had a lot of pain inside of them. They've had a lot of anxiety, they've had a lot of anger, they've had a lot of whatever inside them, and they haven't had a way to get it out. And that book, for whatever reason, has given them the language to be able to talk about what's been bothering them. And no, it's not the book itself, but it doesn't matter because the book gave them the language. So, you always, when I see one of those, I always think, wow, well, there's somebody I really helped out.
Well, there you go. You see, you're out there doing God's work.
Exactly. If there were a God, I would be doing their work.
You'd be doing their work, you see, and you don't even know it. See, that's what a great life.
Exactly.
Hey, listen, so violence.
Yeah.
Violence on the page and action and stuff. Are you aware of it? Are you conscious of it? Are you thinking about how you're going to write something that is, let's say, aggressive or violent for people to read? Are you trying to be a little bit less, aggressive in certain matters, or does it matter to you? Do you just write it, or are you thinking about the reader?
I just write it because I'm just always looking for drama, right? My question is never, how much do I fine tune the degree of an action scene or a scene of violence or a scene with even sex in it? I don't write a lot of sex scenes. Again, something I think my wife believes the world should be grateful for. She's always nervous when I say, "Oh, I just wrote a love scene in this book." But I'm just looking for drama. I'm just like, okay, where do I get the maximum drama from? Because the maximum drama almost never comes from the most grotesquely descriptive, violent passage. I mean, sometimes it can be, but most of the time it's not. That said, as authors, we are constrained by any number of things, including our publishers and what our publishers are worried about. And so I've had a lot of occasions, especially, if you write young adult, that's where a lot of things come into play. Because while you can have all kinds of grotesque violence in young adult fiction, there's a lot of concern when it comes to anything approaching, sexual abuse, for example. And in the 5th Spellslinger book, which is called Queenslayer, there was a scene that in the original draft of the book, when I write my first draft of a book, I let it all hang out. Like I will go wherever drama takes me, because it's much, much easier to rein something in after the fact than it is to try to push it further if you've started with something mediocre. You have to, it's like, one of the first good acting tips I had when I was a terrible actor was, just go so insanely big in your first couple of rehearsals that it's ridiculous. It's almost embarrassing, because you can always pull that back. But if you're starting too close, then you can't go anywhere. And so, that book and that scene that happens in Queenslayer was a dark and troubling scene. And I just went back and forth. And it's so funny, because my editor at the time said, this is this is the best scene in the whole series. Now we have to change it entirely. And so we just went back and forth, and I took out, and it was such an interesting experience, because I took out a lot of the explicit violence, the explicit sort of moments, and reduced it to things that were not so explicitly grotesque, but which, because, when you're a writer and you're trying to write for drama, you tend to write viscerally. And so, for example, there's a moment where literally all that's happening is the character is grabbing this person by the collar, and he can feel the buttons split on the collar, and he can feel the fabric just starting to tear between his fingers. And it's just that. And the editor was troubled by that. Right. Like, and so it comes down to, it's a very difficult, set of waters to navigate. We have this notion now of, people will talk about trigger warnings. I think blessedly we talk about them a little less now than we used to. But if you look at, what actually troubles readers, far more people will be haunted and disturbed and put down your book because you killed a dog,
Right.
than because you committed an incredibly graphic, slaying.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah. So that's okay, but we all have to just admit that it's not our moral sensibilities that are causing us to sort of, stamp our feet or pound our fists on the table. It is just the things that happen to distress us. And it's okay that those distress us, but, so with violence, it's only interesting to me as a component of drama. And that's usually always going to dictate how far I go or don't go with it.
Well, where can you draw that from as a writer? When you talk about the word use, which really is what you're talking about there, when you're trying to bring the right amount of drama out to people, or excitement, adventure, but at the same time not overdo it, not be overly graphic. So there's a real art to the word use that you have through your each paragraph. How like, where does that come from for you, and how do you decide what that level's at?
For me, I'm always on a quest to experience. I want the act of writing to be as much like the act of reading as possible. And so when I'm writing, I'm trying to write in such a way that I'm experiencing what I would experience if I was just reading it for the first time, which sounds like either impossible or incredibly complicated, but it's actually quite easy, right? When you're sort of in that flow, if you're just letting your imagination go as your fingers are hitting the keyboard, you're often experiencing those things. When I start to feel something is disturbing, for example, I'll go, my first feeling will be, okay, I'm onto something, because this should be disturbing. I don't want people to think that, that an act of violence is always just, totally fine because it happened to happen with a sword or something. When I start to feel, though, I feel like I'm in a different novel now. I feel like maybe I'm in one of those, sort of a horror novel, for example. Then I'll go, okay, I'm sliding off the track. I'm moving the boundary between between dramatic and, let's say, salacious, for want of a better word. It's the same. I think it's easier to understand if we imagine writing like a romance scene, right? Or a, let's say, a sex scene. I don't write a lot of those, but if you were writing that and you were feeling absolutely nothing and you're like, okay, well, mechanically, this goes here and this hand went up here. Okay. They've each got two hands and they've each got, so let's just, this one goes here, this one goes here. You'd feel like, okay, this is terrible. But if you were writing and you start to feel like, oh, okay, this is actually kind of arousing, like this scene, then that would be great. And if you start going, this is really feeling like I'm in a porn movie, then, you've gone too far.
Keep writing.
Keep writing. Yeah, keep writing it. Yeah, just just write under a pseudonym. You have to write, in a very broader non-sexual sense, you have to write what turns you on. Because otherwise, what are you doing? It becomes engineering at that point. If you're not feeling it. So you're going by feel. And that's, there's so much discussion of the writing craft these days. So many books, how to write your novel, so many courses, and they are all about the mechanics. And we forget sometimes that, the act of writing is the act of, putting your own humanity on the page. So you have to just learn to feel it. And that's why it's not an easy job.
Well, can you always feel that you have to rely on your editors to rein you in a bit? Because I know from time to time, I'll write something and, I'll give it to my wife to read as the first reader, and she'll be like, "Oh, this was good. It was very gory." And I'm like, "It was gory?" And I didn't notice, the language that I used or whatever. And I kind of sometimes, I guess, need that outside source. Is that the same thing for you, or can you typically navigate that?
I think that's usually the only problem for people who are diagnosed as potential psychopaths. So
yes, exactly.
But it's I heard all the stuff about the karate stuff, and
yeah.
And the old joke, right? What do you call a guy who hangs around with musicians? A drummer. What do you call a guy who hangs around with martial artists?
Psychopath.
A black belt in karate.
Yeah.
Just I'm gonna get a lot of bad letters for that. There's a lot of people who love karate, and I respect them. I rely on Christina, my wife, as my first reader all the time. She is absolutely the one person who can say, cut this, and I'll cut it no matter what. Usually, as I'm sure, we've all encountered, what'll happen, I find with editors, they're very good at saying there's something wrong here, but their solutions are rarely going to be the ones that are exactly right for that writer, even when there's incredible editors and even when they really know the writer quite well. I rely on people saying, I feel like there's a problem here, but then I rely on myself to figure out how to navigate out of it. I don't usually have that so much. I think perhaps because I was a fight choreographer for a while. So I choreographed sword fights for the theater, which is a great way to learn about story, because you often can't rely on the words. In a Shakespeare play, it's often like all this magnificent dialogue and drama, and then in the script it goes, they fight. And then it's like somebody dies. And so you have to learn how to tell a story through the violence. And I think that's probably my best gauge is if any particular scene or any particular violence is telling a story inside of it, it'll be very difficult for me to cut that. It'll be very difficult for me to water that down. But almost universally, my experience has been when someone says that, it's kind of funny you said your wife's reaction, when someone says, that was great, it's really gory, it's like, yeah, that's cool, that's what it was meant to be, right? And I mean, but if they say, it was, I'm gonna go stay with my sister, then it's the wrong gory. And so far, Christina has never said, I'm going to go stay with my sister after reading a novel. Although her best friend in Switzerland, when she read Night's Shadow, which was the sequel to Traitor's Blade, and has what I believe is the longest torture scene in fiction, said that she was thinking of calling the cops after she read it, just to make sure Christina was okay. So it's possible that there was a time I went overboard.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the thing is with Dave, he's writing romance. So.
Yeah, right.
Hey, we all know this, right? Like all great literature is about contrast and conflict, right? So if you're writing romance, that's where you need the most number of serial killers. And if you're writing, serial killer fiction, that's where you need just lots of romance and flowers and dates on yachts.
Yeah,
exactly.
Gore is the same. So now we're talking subtext and meaning here now. Sometimes it comes organically, and sometimes it comes from the writer, a thought of something while they're writing it. What is it for you? Is there any meaning to the book besides entertainment and pure action? Is there something more you want the reader to take away?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the thing is, if it was only action and entertainment, it would be neither action-packed nor entertaining. Because, action is only dramatic when there's something at stake. And the thing that's at stake for a reader is never, the handsome prince is trapped in the castle and the daring, princess has to go rescue them. It's not, the reader knows there's no prince in the castle. What's at stake is all of these characters have said this princess has no business, taking risks or doing whatever else. And so what's at stake is that true or not? And so therefore, like a book without a theme just ultimately isn't entertaining. Because there's nothing for me anyway, there's just no stakes. Because again, the stakes are not, will the village get destroyed by the dragon? It's, is it true or not that if we all get together and put our prejudices aside, we can save each other? Because that's the thing you take into your life as you leave the book. That said, I am one of those writers where I constantly think I know what it is I'm going to be writing about, and I only ever know what the story I've written was when I hit the end. And Malevolent 7 is a good example of that, actually, because that was a book, as I said, I started out just going, you know what, I'm just going to write whatever I want. It's going to be bombastic. It's going to be fun. It's going to be wild. It's going to be dark. I'm going to push the boundaries of all the things that I was really not supposed to push when writing a young adult series, and which I wouldn't have wanted to put into a young adult series because it can become distracting from the things that are equally difficult and challenging that, teenagers actually have to go through in their lives. So I was just like, I'm just going to go wild and have a good time. And by the time I hit the end of the book, I realized, like on the last chapter, I went, oh God, so that's what I've been writing about all this time. That's why I wrote this book. I was writing a book about, again, it's a big fantasy romp adventure with magic and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. But at its heart, it's a book about how in our world, we have decided to break each other apart into good guys and bad guys. And a bad guy or bad person is anybody who's ever done anything bad. And once you're the bad person, that's it. There's not a lot of room for redemption, unless you're a really, really good looking celebrity. And so what I was realizing was troubling me was, okay, how is that going to work? Like, what happens when, you can be, there's kids that are 16 years old now who are convinced that they're just awful. That they've already committed enough moral crimes in their lives that they're unredeemable. And what happens when people grow up thinking that they're, and what happens again, going back, when you need the firefighter, to risk their lives for someone who they reckon probably hates them, or just feels like has been told so often that they're awful, that they don't feel obliged to do anything. And so with this book, I'm starting with these 7 characters. And like I say, they're mercenaries. They're sort of anti-heroes. And they have convinced themselves that, we're kind of the bad guys. And you know what? That's just how the world works. But at a certain point, they're the only ones available to try and solve this problem that's going to hurt other people. And so I wanted to explore, how do you get back from feeling like you are just, worthless? And because you're worthless, you have no obligation to do anything good for anybody else. How do you start from there, make those characters human, make them interesting, make them funny, make them lovable in their own ways, and then get to a place where we go, okay, yeah, they still have problems, but they're not, but none of us are irredeemable.
Well, there you go. So there's hope for me yet.
No.
Oh,
Not at all.
well,
Not according to Dave's blog.
No.
well, yeah, well, if I could read, I would read it. And
Somebody's reading that?
Well, yeah.
Isn't that the best thing
Somebody
about being
somewhere.
Isn't that the best thing about being a writer, though? You no longer have to read anything.
That's right.
Yeah. I don't read anything.
People ask me to read books. I'm just like, I'm in the middle of writing a book, and whenever I'm writing a book, I just can't read anything else.
Exactly.
Everyone else is garbage. I'm the only good writer here. Come on.
Do you guys ever find when you? I ask people this a lot now. Sorry, I've decided this interview is not going where I want. I'm going to be the interviewer now.
Okay. Yeah.
Alan, David, in your work, do you find after you've finished a book, and then you set it aside for a few months, and then you come to it again after it's been published, and you sit down and read it? Do you find yourself going, okay, I remember this book, yeah, it's fine? Or do you find yourself going, holy crap, this thing's amazing. Who wrote this? I want to read everything they write.
No, I wouldn't reread my stuff. It's the worst garbage in the world. Are you kidding? I can't believe people buy this. That's what I say.
Yeah, I look at it and say, oh man, I need to go back and edit this.
Wow.
There you go. But I guess you've grown when you look at it and you go, oh man, this is just, what did I do?
Yeah. Well, how does it change you? But how does this change you each time you write a book?
Well, I got to say, when I go back and read one of my books after it's published, and so, often the context will be, it was copy edited ages ago, and now I'm just going through the proofs, which is happening for me right now with a book called Play of Shadows that comes out next year. Or it happens if I'll read, when I was starting a new Greatcoat series, I have to read the previous books, and I'd be reading Tyrant's Throne, which was the last book in there. And I swear to God, I would go, oh my God, this is so great. I love this so much. I wish I knew how to write this. So I think I don't grow. I think I just get dumber after I write a book. So
each time you go through that experience and put something out, you lose something.
Yeah. There's just a certain, I keep trying to be the guy, I think I so admire like the pulp writers, and I keep trying to be the guy who just goes, it's just a book. I sit down and I just write whatever I feel like, and I don't think about it twice, but it never works for me. I always have to find something. And as you asked about like the growing process, and that is in a way is for me what writing a novel is. It's why I think everybody should write a novel, because, it's a chance to explore something and kind of create a bridge between yourself and the world as you see it. So, people always ask writers, novelists especially, like, where do you get your ideas from? And, we all have our different gags that we use when asked that. But the more honest answer for me is, my ideas come from the gap between what I feel inside and what I see in the world. I will have a set of beliefs about things, and then I see the world and it doesn't conform to those. And so I go, how the hell do I reconcile that? And so I'll think of a character who is, experiencing that same sort of similar angst to me, or perhaps the opposite. And then you sort of start writing and you start exploring. And then by the time you're done, no matter what happens with the book, I've written novels every year. I'll write, maybe 3 novels. And almost one of them will usually be one that will probably never be published. But it doesn't matter, because that novel will be the way that I found out how to make peace with the world about whatever that issue happened to be.
And that's the book about sex and violence.
Yes. That's the 16-volume erotic adventures.
The one the wife says, no, don't do that. Yeah.
Are we worried about Utah again?
Oh, no, not at all. They know I'm not worried about
16-volume otter erotica series. That's the next big project.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I was hoping to recruit the two of you to come on board with that.
I'd love to, but I'm just I'm a prim and proper girl. I could never do such things. I don't know.
Such a prude.
The otters are also serial killers.
Now it's starting to get interesting.
Yeah.
But Well, listen. So how are readers and people and fans going to find you? Are you at a local bar, or do you have like a website? Do you have social media? Hookup apps? Like, where do people find Sebastien?
I don't have a Tinder or Grindr profile, so
Well,
that would be that. Although, come on, is this not? Have we not just stumbled upon one of the great author marketing concepts of all time? The only way to reach an author and talk about the books and find out about their books is on like Tinder or Grindr.
I think so.
Because let's face it, Facebook is for very angry,
Baby boomers.
aging people, and Twitter is for robots and Elon Musk. Maybe it hasn't always been the case of all of these platforms that they just get invaded by like an alien species that propagates. Let's make novelists the weird alien species that propagates onto like, the worst platforms. I have a good friend who's a plumber, and I was, he's always, expanding, and I was like, you got to get an OnlyFans page.
I know an author that did that, but I'm not saying any names.
Well, but in my case, in my draft case, so the best way to reach me is my website, which is decastell.com, DECASTELL.com. I'm super easy to find on Google. If you even misspell Sebastien de Castell, you will likely find me there, or on some police blotter somewhere. I'm on Twitter is @DeCastell, and I'm on Facebook, but again, really, who's on Facebook? And I'm, I do events. I'm doing an event here in Vancouver on the 16th of May, so tomorrow. Holy crap, I got to get ready for that. And I'm doing something with the Saskatoon McNally Robinson, and then I'm off to England to do a bunch of events, and I'm always around. And I reply to all reader mail, even when it's angry and bitter. So, David, your reply is coming soon, I promise.
Oh, perfect.
Oh, that's nice of you. That's important. I think it's good to stay in touch with people that follow you, no matter what.
Yeah,
it's a good thing. So, and so you like these events? Do you like going to these events and shows and book signings and all that? Do you really kind of enjoy that?
I do. I just like meeting people that, I never sort of think of readers as fans per se. I mean, they're fans of a book. They're not so much fans of me, because obviously if they knew who I was, But when someone is a huge fan of a book, and this was especially true for the Greatcoats novels, but I think is also true for Malevolent 7, this latest one, is that what it really means is that what I was connecting to, what I'm writing about, what I'm sort of exploring, is something that they're also tuned into. And so it's kind of like, being two people that like the Cleveland Barons hockey team, and like there can't be very many of those. And so when you meet one, you're like, wow, this is so great. That was a deep cut, the Cleveland Barons.
I was going to say, oh, wow. What are you trying to say? Someone's going to be hurt.
I can't even remember when they stopped being a hockey team.
I can't even remember them. So it's all a blur.
They just had a good logo.
Well,
when I was a little kid, I judged hockey teams by their logos.
Well, what else can you?
Exactly. How do you think the Pittsburgh Penguins have been around so long?
Well, see, we're not going to get into this. This is terrible. Anyway, we've had an enjoyable time here. The author's got a new book out, of course, Mr. Sebastien de Castell. So thank you for being here. We really enjoy it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Sebastien.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me? Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.